Just after midnight, October 1968, Gene Kowalski had been driving nights out of a small independent lot 2 blocks off the Strip for about 4 years, long enough to know which casino doorman would tip him off to a departing high roller, which bellman expected a cut, and which street corners belonged, by nobody's official rule, but everyone's private understanding, to which company. A couple flagged him down outside a casino porte-cochere a little after midnight. 2 suitcases, a flight to catch, McCarran bound. It was the kind of fare every driver on the Strip wanted. A long run, a fixed destination, cash at the end of it, no waiting around for the next flag. Kowalski pulled to the curb. Before he had the trunk open, a second cab, different paint, different company markings, cut across 2 lanes of traffic and stopped nose to nose with his, blocking the loading zone entirely. The other driver was out of his seat before the engine had fully stopped, already talking. By late 1968, this was not an unusual scene outside a Strip casino at midnight. It had become, in the language later used by the state officials who studied the period, close to routine. This was one incident among what documented industry accounts describe as more than a decade of similar confrontations. Company against company, driver against driver, concentrated wherever the richest fares gathered. Casino porte-cocheres after midnight, the entrance to a major convention hotel, and, most of all, the curb outside the airport. None of it was organized, and none of it was sanctioned by any company as policy. It was simply what happened when too many drivers, working for too many companies, chased too few of the fares worth chasing. For Kowalski, a blocked pickup like this one meant a lost fare, a wasted half hour, and, more than either, the accumulating sense that the job had no floor under it, no dispatcher to appeal to, no regulator to complain to, nothing standing between one driver's claim to a fare and another driver's willingness to fight for it. Documented industry histories written after the fact would treat 1968 as close to the peak of this pattern, the year before the state finally acted, though the underlying conditions had been building for most of the preceding decade. What made this particular moment worth stopping on wasn't the shouting, or even the blocked cab. It was what didn't happen next. Neither driver picked up a radio. Neither one called a company office, a dispatcher, or the police. There was, in a fairly literal sense, no one whose job it was to settle this. The fare, one airport run, one fixed rate, cash, was worth contesting, because in Las Vegas, in 1968, no system existed telling either man he couldn't. What made a single ride to McCarran worth a shouting match in a hotel driveway, and what was actually being contested when 2 drivers squared off over one fare, and neither of them thought to report it to anyone. Before you can understand why 2 drivers fought over a curb space, you need to understand what the Las Vegas taxi industry legally was in 1968. Nothing. Not in the way New York or Chicago had licensing boards and permit caps by then. Nevada had no state authority governing who could operate a cab, how many companies could exist, what a fare should cost on a given route, or what condition a vehicle had to be in to carry a paying passenger. Any operator willing to buy a used sedan, paint a name on the door, and mount a meter could put a cab on the street. By the late 1960s, that low barrier had produced more competing companies than the market actually needed, outside of peak convention weeks. Companies with no shared radio frequency, no shared fare structure, and, other than each other, no real regulator watching how they behave toward a rival's driver, blocking a rival's fare. Photographs and industry records from the period show no single standard car, defining a Las Vegas cab, the way the Checker Marathon defined New York's fleet. Independent operators bought whatever ran and lasted. Full-size Ford, Dodge, and Plymouth sedans, built to the same fleet duty specifications taxi companies nationwide favored, alongside second-hand Checkers bought used rather than ordered new. Insurance, where it existed, varied company to company. Some documented accounts from the period describe vehicles operating without any at all. Several of the companies competing for this same stretch of casino and airport fares in the late 1960s carried names still recognizable in Las Vegas today. Yellow, Checker, Western, and Desert Cab among them, the last founded in 1960. Their survival into the present says little about how orderly their operations were at the time. If anything, their sheer number is itself evidence of how easy the market was to enter. A new company needed no state license, no proof of adequate insurance, and no demonstrated need for additional cabs on the road. Only capital enough to buy a few used sedans and paint them. During the city's biggest convention weeks, when hotel occupancy spiked and demand briefly outstripped even this oversized fleet, competition and shortage aligned in nobody's favor, passengers standing outside without a ride, and companies still finding it worthwhile to fight over the fares that did materialize, because on a slower week, a driver couldn't count on there being another one. Before we go further, if this kind of documentation matters to you, consider subscribing. Every video here goes into one specific aspect of American cab culture: the vehicle, the shift, the licensing system, the dispatch, and the specific knowledge of the driver who knew their city in a way no app has replicated. What a Las Vegas driver knew in 1968 was which company's colors meant a fight over a fare, a kind of knowledge no regulation could fully replace, and no algorithm has replicated since. And if you drove a cab in this era, or your family did, leave it in the comments. If you or someone you know drove in Las Vegas before 1969, or in the years right after the Taxicab Authority was formed, what do you remember about how the companies actually operated? The system Nevada built in 1969 to police its own taxi industry is the same one, amended but intact, that still decides who can pick up a fare at Harry Reid International today. Back to the cab. What none of these companies provided, what no city or state office provided either, was a way to settle a dispute over a fare without settling it in the driveway. The system a passenger saw was a taxi with a company name on the door. What a driver like Kowalski actually operated inside was closer to an unregulated market with cars in it. What did an unregulated market for rides to and from a resort corridor actually produce, once enough companies were competing for the same finite set of fares? What 4 years on the night shift actually taught Kowalski wasn't a street map. Every driver had that inside a month. It was a private, unofficial geography of risk, which hotel entrances were treated as another company's unspoken territory after dark, which dispatchers, working for rival companies, would radio their own drivers to cut off a competitor's cab rather than let a fare go to whoever arrived first. Which fares were worth contesting at all? A short in-town hop wasn't. An airport run almost always was, because the math of an unregulated market rewarded volume and distance over patience. None of this was written down. None of it appeared in any company handbook, because in 1968, most of these companies didn't have one. It moved driver to driver, the way information travels through any workforce, with no formal training program and no state licensing exam, standing between a man and the driver's seat. This kind of knowledge accumulated fastest for drivers working nights, because a resort city's night economy produced its own specific traffic. Casino and hotel staff finishing late shifts, dealers and entertainers heading home after the strip's shows and tables closed, and a steady trickle of gamblers moving between properties long after the airport runs had thinned out. None of these fares was as valuable as an airport trip, but they were frequent, and frequency taught a driver the same lesson volume did: which streets moved, which corners were claimed, and which companies were, at any given hour, willing to enforce that claim. That absence of formal credentialing also shaped how long men stayed in the trade. Entry into cab driving was as easy as exit. A driver who found the market's constant low-grade conflict not worth the fares could simply stop showing up, and another man with no more vetting than he'd had could take his seat within the week. What experienced drivers like Kowalski accumulated wasn't protected by any barrier to entry. It simply outlasted the men who didn't stay long enough to learn it. That last detail mattered more than it might sound. Documented accounts from this period consistently note that Nevada had no background check requirement for cab drivers before 1969. No criminal history review, no standard fitness test, nothing beyond a company's own hiring judgment. A passenger climbing into a cab outside a casino at midnight had no way of knowing whether the man driving had been vetted by anyone at all, only that his door said a company name. What, exactly, was a passenger actually trusting when they got into an unmarked, unregulated Las Vegas cab in 1968? And how much of that trust was resting on nothing more than the paint job? The car itself carried the same uncertainty as the man driving it. Insurance requirements, where they existed at all, were set company by company rather than by any state minimum, meaning a passenger in one cab might be riding in a vehicle with no liability coverage behind it whatsoever, with no way to tell from the back seat. Vehicle condition worked the same way. With no state inspection standard, a company's fleet was only as safe as that company chose to keep it, and in a market where too many operators were competing for a limited set of fares, keeping a vehicle running took priority over keeping it right. The absence of any inspection requirement meant that two taxis parked at the same casino curb, indistinguishable to a passenger climbing into either one, might represent two entirely different levels of risk. One from a company that kept its fleet in reasonable condition out of its own business sense, the other from an operator running vehicles until they failed outright. There was no sticker, no posted rating, no way to tell the difference from the back seat, because nothing in Nevada law required the difference to be disclosed. Documented accounts of the era describe another consequence of the same unregulated competition, more direct than a worn brake line. Vehicles set on fire. Rival companies' cabs damaged or destroyed, one part of a broader pattern of confrontation between drivers and operators fighting over the same shrinking margin of fares. Because no single agency tracked incidents across competing companies, no comprehensive count of exactly how many vehicles were damaged or destroyed this way survives in the documented record. Only the consistent description, repeated across later journalism and testimony, that the practice was common enough to be remembered specifically as part of what taxi wars meant. None of this happened because Las Vegas cab drivers in the 1960s were unusually violent men. It happened because the city had built, without quite meaning to, a market with real money in it, and no referee. Every incentive in that market pushed toward exactly the kind of confrontation Kowalski watched play out over a couple's luggage outside a casino porte cochere. And none of the incentives pointed toward a solution, because no single company involved had the standing or the interest to impose one on the others. What does an industry look like when every operator in it has a reason to want order, and no one in it has the authority to create it? Before you can understand why Nevada's state legislature, not a city council, not a local licensing board, the legislature itself, eventually stepped into a dispute between competing taxi companies, you need to understand what a cab ride meant to Las Vegas's actual business in the 1960s. This was a city whose entire economy depended on a specific kind of first impression. Passenger traffic through McCarran Field had grown from roughly 1 million travelers a year at the start of the decade to more than double that by 1970, as the Strip's resort corridor expanded and casinos competed to draw tourists in from across the country. For a visitor arriving on one of those flights, the taxi wasn't incidental to the Las Vegas experience. For a large share of them, it was the first part of it, the ride from McCarran's terminal to whichever resort they'd booked, and often the last part of it too, on the way back out. Casino operators understood this with a bluntness that had nothing to do with sentiment. Documented accounts from the period describe resort executives growing concerned that visible taxi violence and unreliable service were becoming a genuine liability to the tourism economy the entire Strip depended on. Not a side issue, but a direct threat to the product the city was selling. A tourist who watched two cab drivers argue over a fare, or who rode in an uninsured vehicle without ever knowing it, was a tourist Las Vegas could not afford to lose. and word of mouth in a business built on repeat visitors traveled fast. This was also the decade in which Las Vegas was actively building the reputation it would carry for the rest of the century. The years of Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., and Wayne Newton as fixtures of the Strip's entertainment, and of Howard Hughes buying into the Desert Inn and other properties between 1966 and 1970. McCarran itself was expanding to match the ambition, adding its first international flight in 1968 and growing to more than 2 million annual passengers by 1970. A city investing that heavily in its image as a glamorous, controlled destination had a direct stake in making sure a visitor's first 10 minutes on the ground, the ride from McCarran to the Strip, didn't undercut everything the marquees were selling. What happens when the people with the most money riding on a city's reputation are also the people with the least formal authority to fix what's damaging it? If there was one place in Las Vegas where the unregulated taxi market showed itself most plainly, it was the curb outside McCarran's terminal. This was where every company's incentive collided at once. The highest value fares in the city, long airport runs to Strip resorts, paid in cash, often by out-of-town visitors unfamiliar enough with the local rate structure not to question it, concentrated into a single loading zone that any operator could enter, with no formal queue, no assigned rotation, and no agreed order of service. Later reporting on the period would describe the resulting competition in blunt terms. Rival drivers contesting access to McCarran's arrivals curbed directly. For an experienced driver like Kowalski, working the airport wasn't a separate skill from working the Strip so much as a more concentrated version of the same problem. He knew which flights typically carried business travelers likely to tip well, and which carried tour groups more likely to be shepherded straight onto a resort's own shuttle before a cab ever got near them. He knew how early in a flight's arrival window it was worth positioning a cab near the curb, and how much of that positioning was actually about beating 3 other drivers to the same door rather than serving any passenger better. None of that knowledge showed up anywhere a passenger could see it. What they saw was a taxi stand. What was actually operating underneath it was closer to an uncontrolled auction, and the currency wasn't money, it was whoever got there, and stayed there, first. Airport officials and casino operators had no formal authority to change any of this themselves. The curb belonged, functionally, to whichever cab occupied it, and neither the airport nor any single resort had standing to impose a queue on companies it didn't own or license. What they could do was complain, publicly and often, and by the late 1960s, those complaints had become loud enough and specific enough to McCarran's curb that they were difficult for state lawmakers to keep ignoring. What did it mean for a city trying to sell itself as a smooth, glamorous arrival that its own airport curb had become the site of its taxi industry's worst behavior? By the late 1960s, the pattern had gone on long enough and grown public enough that it reached the Nevada Legislature directly, not as a local licensing dispute, but as a statewide concern. Former state legislator Richard Bryan, who served in the Assembly during this period, later described the situation bluntly. By his account, conditions in the industry had deteriorated to the point that, in his words, all hell had broken loose in the taxi industry. In 1969, lawmakers responded by creating the Nevada Taxicab Authority, a state agency built specifically to govern Clark County's taxi industry. With a structure almost unheard of elsewhere in the country, regulatory power over licensing, fares, and vehicle standards, combined with actual law enforcement authority to investigate and cite violations directly, rather than relying on a separate police agency to enforce taxi rules after the fact. Bryan served in the Assembly at the time, alongside a young colleague named Harry Reid, who would go on to represent Nevada in the United States Senate for nearly 3 decades, both of whom would later look back on 1969 as the year the state finally decided an unregulated taxi market had become a liability it could no longer tolerate. This was not a modest bureaucratic fix. It was a state deciding that an industry it had, for over a decade, effectively let govern itself, could no longer be trusted to do so, and that the ordinary tools of city licensing weren't strong enough to change the underlying incentives. Unlike most other states, where a taxi commission answers to a city council or a mayor's office, the Nevada Taxicab Authority answered, and still answers, directly to the state, with its own investigators and its own citation authority. That structure is a direct legacy of how badly city and county-level oversight had already failed in the years leading up to 1969. The new authority set out to do what no individual company and no unregulated market had been able to do on its own. Fix the number of permits in circulation, set uniform standards for insurance and vehicle condition, and give the state a mechanism to actually enforce them, curb by curb, on the ground. For the first time, a Las Vegas cab was required to carry the insurance coverage its passengers had always assumed, without evidence, that it already had. What happens to a market built entirely around competition for scarce fares, once the number of companies competing for them is no longer left up to anyone who can afford a used sedan and a paint job? The regulatory system Nevada built in 1969 changed what a Las Vegas cab driver actually needed to know to survive. The private geography Kowalski had spent 4 years learning, which corners belonged to which company, which dispatchers would cut off a rival's driver, which fares were worth a fight, became largely irrelevant almost overnight, not because the drivers forgot it, but because the state had removed the conditions that made it necessary. Permits were capped, standards were set, and for the first time, there was an office whose entire job was to enforce them, rather than a curb where the strongest or fastest driver simply won. What replaced that private geography wasn't nothing. A new driver working Las Vegas after 1969 still needed to learn the city, which resorts produced the steadiest fares, which shifts were busiest, how the airport queue actually moved once it had an actual queue. But that knowledge was now built on top of a floor the state had put in place: a capped number of permits, an inspected vehicle, an insured ride, and an agency whose entire purpose was making sure the next dispute over a fare never had to be settled the way Kowalski's was, in a hotel driveway with no one to call. What the Taxicab Authority's founding mission records is straightforward: an agency created to ensure the safety, comfort, and convenience of the riding public through regulation of the industry. What it doesn't record, what no regulatory filing could, is what happened to the specific, hard-won knowledge that men like Kowalski had built over years of working a lawless curb. That knowledge had no formal home. It could not be transferred into the new system, because the new system was built to make it unnecessary. It simply stopped mattering, the way any survival skill stops mattering once the danger it was built for is regulated out of existence. It is worth noting, too, that the men who built and unofficially enforced that private knowledge left almost no individual trace in the documented record. No named oral histories, no company personnel files preserved for public research. Nothing beyond the general pattern historians and journalists have since reconstructed. That absence is itself part of the story. An entire working knowledge base, developed and applied daily for the better part of a decade, that regulation made obsolete before anyone thought to write it down. The framework created in 1969, amended many times, but never replaced, is still, in its basic structure, what governs who can pick up a fare at Las Vegas's airport today. It is a rare case of an American taxi system, built directly out of a documented crisis, in a single legislative act, rather than evolving gradually, the way most cities' taxi regulations did. The men who fought over that one fare to McCarran in 1968 never anticipated becoming, retroactively, the reason a state built one of the country's most tightly regulated taxi authorities. They were just trying to get paid for a ride. If this channel is worth subscribing to, that's how you tell us. What a Las Vegas driver knew in the years before 1969 was survival knowledge for a market that no longer exists in that form. A kind of expertise regulation made obsolete almost overnight, and that no algorithm ever had to replicate. Because the state got there first. And if you have a cab story from this era, as a driver, as a regular passenger, or as someone whose city this was, write it in the comments. If you or someone in your family drove in Las Vegas before 1969, or remembers the taxi industry in the years right after, tell us which company, which shift, which stretch of the Strip.